It's always sad to me when a band releases an album and it doesn't get the attention it deserves just because it was released in the wrong time period. And this happened a lot in the mid 90s. I worked at a music store selling CDs, and I remember we would get shipments in from record labels, and they would be of these bands that used to be gigantic, that used to sell out stadiums, and every time they had a release, it was a huge deal. So it was really strange to have an album come in from like Skid Row, and really there was no buzz about it. People weren't really talking about it like they used to back when Slave to the Grind came out. So today I wanted to highlight 6 of those releases that I feel were really great albums that just hit at the wrong time and got ignored.
Warrants. Ultraphobic.
So the first album I want to talk about is Warrant's Ultraphobic. It came out in 1995, and I was really curious to see how it was going to sound because a lot of bands that were formerly, in the hard rock, hair metal type circles, they all seemed to alter their sound a little bit to fit more in with what was big at the time, which was that grungier sound. And so I put it in, and right off the bat, I thought, oh man, they sound a lot like Alice in Chains now. And this happened with a lot of bands at this time because I think Alice in Chains was the closest thing to the hard rock scene that was going on before, but still considered part of the grunge movement. They're from Seattle and all. Also, the production of the album sounded a lot different than earlier Warrant albums. It was a lot more raw. Because a lot of these bands didn't have too much to lose, everything had already been flipped on them, I feel like they took a lot more chances, and they did certain things they would have never done back when they were a little bit more commercially accepted. So they have a 7/8 measure in one of their choruses, which I thought was really cool to hear, like prog Warrant all of a sudden. We all die alone. But the song that stuck with me the most is the song called Sum of One. For some reason, that chorus just will not leave my head as soon as I hear it. But the album ends on a very strong track. It's actually more of an acoustic ballad. A lot of bands would do that. They'd have a full rockin' album, and at the very end it would go out on an acoustic note. And the song is called Stronger Now, and it's actually kind of an emotional song for me to listen to because I always think about what eventually happened to Janie Lane, and it just kind of makes it hard to listen to.
And I'm so much stronger now.
Kiss. Carnival of Souls.
When this came out, I resisted listening to it for the longest time. My friend kept trying to get me to listen to it. He's like, it's actually a really great album. Check it out. And I was afraid I wasn't going to like it because I know what Kiss tends to do. Ever since I was a kid, I saw them do this, where they're like master chameleons. So whatever's big at the time, they're good at implementing some of that sound into their songs. And usually they pull it off really well. I even love Disco Kiss. But as far as being ready to hear grunge Kiss, for some reason I just wasn't there yet. So it took me many months before I finally sat down with it, and I learned to really appreciate it. I'm glad I did not overlook this album. Right off the bat with the song Hate, you just know it's going to be an in-your-face, dry, powerful sound. And, Gene's up to his old tricks again.
Hey, it's what I am.
And just like Mr. Blackwell, I always love those real evil Gene songs that sometimes don't get the attention I think they deserve. And on this album, there's a song called I Confess, which, just listen to it. I don't want to give it away, but I think it's going to be one of your favorite Gene songs.
You confess you can help yourself.
Jungle has one of the coolest intros ever. Every time I play it for somebody, they always love it. It's a sweet circular bass line, actually played by Bruce Kulick. And speaking of Bruce, one of his best solos, in my opinion, is actually on this album. It's on a song called Seduction of the Innocent. So why don't we actually hear from the man himself? He sent in some short video clips of him briefly explaining what it was like to release a Kiss album during the grunge era. So here we go.
Carnival of Souls, the very, very controversial Kiss album that I happen to really like. Is it a grunge record? Well, that's really up to you. But certainly the times were very, very intense musically. We wanted to respond with a record that was even darker than Revenge. And Carnival of Souls really did that. Gene Simmons loved a lot of the bands that were popular at the time. I dove right into writing riffs that were really intense, odd time signatures behind them. But is it a grunge record? Well, at the time, I guess you could call it a grunge record because we were darker and meaner and uglier and everything. I think we look kind of cool. There really are some fantastic songs on the record that I certainly wouldn't call grunge. Jungle was a single that I helped co-write, and as much as it's interesting, it really didn't necessarily fit a grunge type of style. There's a beautiful ballad from Paul about his son that I think is really touching. I Will Be There.
I will be there.
Gene did this thing called Childhood's End that's very unique, with a Bob Ezrin-like children's choir singing along at the end. So there's a lot of elements on that record that are dark and heavy, and then there's a lot of emotion too that was very different for the band. And I certainly really loved singing a song called I Walk Alone, which was very, very different, very creative. There were backwards effects and a lot of things that had nothing to do with grunge at all.
You don't know me, and I don't know me.
So it's up to you about how we fared on this record, but I'm very proud of this release and my guitar work. And since you guys love guitar, you see the BC Rich Eagle, and here's a beautiful BC Rich Eagle Supreme, the guitar that's on the cover of Carnival of Souls. Thanks a lot.
That's so cool to hear from Bruce himself. I always have to pinch myself every time I communicate with him. Just growing up with him as one of my heroes just seems like a dream now.
Tesla, busted up.
In '94, I remember getting this album in at our store, and I didn't like the cover. I thought it was kind of hokey, and the name of the album is Bust a Nut, which I wasn't too crazy about. But as soon as I listened to it, I got excited because I thought, Tesla is keeping a lot of what made them so awesome. They didn't change their sound too much. They got a little bit heavier on a few songs, but overall it still sounds like the rootsy Tesla that we all love. It starts off with this swirling tribal intro that fades in. I always thought that would be really cool to see him in concert and have him open with that. And then there's a song called Solution that has this killer heavy riff. It's just a headbanging type of riff. It's probably the angriest I ever heard Tesla, and I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of these bands were angry because of what happened in the industry and all that, so they channeled that back into their music, and some of these songs actually got pretty heavy because of that. My favorite song on the album is probably Action Talks. It's got this early Guns N' Roses, Brother Keane, Buck Cherry kind of vibe to it, and the vocals are just ripping.
Hey, what's the deal now? Don't it feel like something's going on?
And if you want to hear a really interesting riff, check out Earth Mover. It's got this Tool quality to it. So if you think Tool meets Led Zeppelin with a little bit of Soundgarden, I think that's what Earth Mover reminds me of.
Winger. Paul.
Out of all these albums, I think the one that surprised me the most is Winger's Pull, which came out in 1993. So that's only a few years after Nirvana came onto the scene and changed everything, basically. And I was really happy with what Winger did because they kept their initial sound for the most part, just got a little bit heavier. So the first track, Blind Revolution Mad, kicks in, and it's got sort of this Pink Floyd-ish kind of floaty sound to it.
To this world, little boy brave.
And then when the band does kick in, you're like, okay, this is powerful. You know, the production is great. It's a little more raw than the earlier Winger stuff. But it still has this gigantic produced sound to it. Now, just like Tesla's Solution, Winger has one of those riffs on this album as well. More than one, but this one really stands out. It's the riff to Junkyard Dog. I actually had to do a double take the first time I heard it to make sure it was still Winger in the CD player. One of the most epic songs that Winger has ever done is on this album. It's called The Lucky One. And it sticks in my head after I listen to it, but not in a pop catchiness type of way. It just has this way of just working its way into your mind, and it's hard to get it out.
You're the lucky one. You're the lucky.
And a song that really is a throwback to the earlier sound is No Man's Land, and it has a great guitar solo in it. But unlike the other bands, they didn't turn it down, they turned it up. And I'm glad they did, because Red Beach really shines on this entire album. It'd be a shame if they brought him down in the mix.
Motley Crue, self-titled.
Now, when it comes to hype, there is an exception, and that was when Motley Crue released their self-titled album. A lot of people were excited because they were wondering what it's going to be like without Vince Neil in the band. Now they had a guy named John Corabi singing and playing guitar as well. So they had 2 guitars for this album, and it's kind of hard to see past that. I mean, the album is killer. It's one of the top 3 on this list, and it's just different than what Motley Crue is. And I think Vince Neil said this as well, like, it's a solid album, but it's just not Motley Crue. They probably should have released it maybe under a different band name, and it may have gotten way more accepted. I'm not sure. The kick drum on this album sounds gigantic. I know Tommy Lee uses a bigger kick drum than most, but every time I hear it, it feels like it's kicking me right in the eardrum every single time. Unlike a lot of these releases, Motley Crue actually had a hit song that was on alternative radio called Hooligan's Holiday. But they were not immune to being influenced by the music at the time, and the song Uncle Jack reflects that a little bit. There's a little bit of Alice in Chains, but also some Pantera, so it's a real hard-hitting tune, pretty heavy. And then they switch gears for a song called Misunderstood. It has more of a Beatles vibe to it, and it stands out because of that.
Oh, life is misunderstood, yeah.
The heaviest song, though, has to be Smoke in the Sky. Once again, if I can compare it to Pantera, if you listen to the song A New Level by Pantera and speed it up, I think you pretty much have the riff to this song.
Skid Row, Subhuman Race.
And the last album I'll talk about, as far as the big 6 here, is going to be Skid Row's Subhuman Race. Like I said before, it was really weird to have a brand new Skid Row album in my hands and not have a giant hype surrounding it. So I put it in, listened to it, and this is when I really realized that a lot of these bands were channeling their anger back into their music. This album, above all the other ones, I think has the angriest vibe. And it really works for Skid Row, because they're already heavy, right? I would call them hard rock bordering on metal for their earlier releases. But this one just pushed it right over the top. Check out My Enemy. The whole song is great, but at the end, Sebastian Bach lets out this scream, and it sounds like 4 voices are coming out. Bass Against My Soul is a fun one. The riff has this really circular heaviness to it, kind of like the Attitude song by Steve Vai. Once again, I'm comparing things, and then at the end, there's just a double bass explosion, so make sure you check that out. You would think Skid Row would be a little more immune to following the sounds that were hot at the time, but the song Breaking Down actually has sort of a 90s vibe to it, and a strange twist happens in the solo as well. It sounds more like, when Zeppelin would do more country-sounding songs sometimes, and you'd get those Jimmy Page Telecaster bends. I get that vibe when I hear the solo to this song. I love it, though. Be sure not to miss the song called Iron Will, just for the drum fills and the bass tone alone. It's totally worth it. Okay, so that's the list. Once again, I want to thank Bruce Kulick for chiming in. It's always an honor to have you on any video. And if anybody has any contributions to add to the list, go ahead and do that in the comments section, and I'll look forward to reading those. All right, everybody, thank you for watching, and we'll catch you at the next video. Bye-bye.